Would you direct your questions here, please? If you have trouble making yourselves heard, there are microphones here at the aisle. If anybody has a question.
I'm rather deaf, you might help me with a question. Repeat them to me.
I'll repeat them to you.
I'm rather deaf, no?
Okay, I'll repeat.
Thank you. Well, it went off quite well, no?
I beg your pardon?
It went off quite well, no? You see that? The Voice of the Wild.
If you have any questions, please, we'll entertain them. If you have trouble making yourself heard, will you use these microphones at the head of the aisles? Anybody care to ask a question? Okay.
Senor Borges, you told us that some friends of yours consider you a poet, others a short story writer. Would it be fair to say that all your work is poetic and you simply write in prose or in verse?
Or that's a very general statement. I think there is no essential difference, except in questions of print, in matter of print, between a poem and a tale. And I may be allowed to recall that poetry, after all, began by the epic. As I say, poetry began by storytelling. You find, for example, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, then you find the Films of Fragments, the Beowulf, and so on, the Chanson de Roland, the Cantar de Miosside. Then you say the poetry began by telling tales. So I wonder if there is an essential difference. When I am, let's say, creating, the word is far too ambitious, but when I am evolving something, I do not know whether what I am thinking of, what I am dreaming about, may turn into a tale or into a poem. And that is supposing quite irrelevant and circumstantial. I suppose you're right, sir. I think of myself as a poet, though none of my friends do. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Do I have to go to the microphone?
Well, I can repeat it if I continue.
In some anthologies of Latin American literature, your name appears along with Bioy Casares and Silvina Ocampo as writers of the so-called fantastic literature. Do you agree with that label, and what does it mean to be a writer of fantastic literature?
Silvina Ocampo and Bioy Casares are very dear friends of mine. And of course, we attempt literature of the fantastic. Of course, I suppose that, let's say, there were times when all literature was a literature of the fantastic, since men believed in ghosts, since men believed in omens. But today, as we are unbelievers, we think of reality as being on one side and of unreality or the fantastic as being on the other. But that, I think, is a mistake, since I wonder whether a railway accident is more real than the dream I had this morning and forgot all about. I suppose all things are real or unreal. In fact, we may call reality the sum total of things. But when I speak of literature of the fantastic, then I think in terms, let's say, books like, well, for example, in The Invisible Man of Wells, we have an invisible man. In those stories I was telling you about, in the Zaire, we have an unforgettable thing. In the Aleph, a point of space, wherein may be found all the points of space. And then those things, of course, are still real, I think. But really, what I don't suppose there is much difference. Suppose if you are writing literature, what you are writing is unreal if you compare it to the reality, or to what is called reality, to commonplace reality. And I suppose it's real since it is also included in the world. I wrote a poem called The Other Tiger. That poem, I think, is one of my good poems. I am thinking of a tiger. I seem to be always thinking of tigers, I don't know why. Something so fine about them. Well, you remember Blake's Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, and of Chesterton, who called the tiger an emblem of awful elegance. Well, I am alone, I'm wandering walking to and fro in the library, and then I think of a tiger. Then I think of that tiger as being in the jungle, in Bengal or in Sumatra. Then I say, I will write a poem about that tiger. Then I describe him, give him metaphors, I give him tropes, I give him adjectives, and after I've written some 10 lines about him, then I think, but after all, what I have written is merely a verbal tiger. How does that affect the real tiger? Then I define the real tiger and say, the real tiger, not the one to be found in the preceding poem, or this one, and then describe him. But the fact of describing him, he is also real. And then I go on looking for the third tiger, and I know that all tigers, all verbal tigers will be what verbal equations. And the real tiger will always be beyond my reach. And then the poem ends, because I know that the search is endless. I know that if I begin searching for the tiger, I'm merely going, let us say, to weave a chain of endless tigers, and I shall never find the other tiger, the tiger who is not in the poem. At the same time, that poem of mine, that makes for the unreality of poetry, makes for reality. Since I think there is a real tiger in Bengal. There is at this moment a real tiger, and there are many tigers in Bengal. At the same time, the tiger of my poem is also an object of the universe. My verbal tiger is as much a part of the universe as a fiery vertebrate tiger in India. So that the poem may be allowed to stand, let's say, as a justification of art. Since when we are writing, we may not be creating mirrors of the universe, or we may be creating things quite as real as mirrors, and quite as real as the rest of the universe.
Are there any other questions?
Earlier in your speech, you said that you seem to regret what happens after one leaves boyhood in reading literature. One loses a certain sense of discovery, and I believe you said that one then begins to analyze literature. Within the context of that comment, what do you feel are the limits of the critic and of literary criticism?
As a critic, I should say that critic is of no importance. I think that what is really important is the pleasure felt by the reader and by the writer also. Of course, we all remember Wordsworth, who thought that he had lost something magical. We remember that poem about intimation of immortality in early childhood, that when he said that a glory had been lost. At the same time, in old age, you may be allowed a quieter glory. You may be allowed a certain serene light. We may look at things in a quieter way. So, when I think of my lost boyhood, my memory of lost boyhood is quite as fine as the boyhood I have lost, and the things, and the plains, and the rivers, and the horses I have lost.
Are there any other questions?
Mr. Borges, it seems fairly obvious to those of us who are students of the field that you really opened the way for the whole new wave of magic realism in Latin American literature. You're the progenitor of that whole explosion. Do you have a sense of some of these authors, Garcia Marquez, Carlos Fuentes, and others, continuing your work?
I have read of these writers, I have only read Garcia Marquez. I think him a very fine writer, a far better writer than myself, of course. But I wonder if he was really helpful. They were written the same thing without me. And if I have helped, well, it's all to the good. But really, since I went blind for reading purposes in 1955, I have done but little contemporary reading. Because when I lost my eyesight in 1955, I felt this will not be the end of something, but the beginning of something else. And then I went in for the study of Old English, now of Old Norse, and I have done little contemporary reading. I'm afraid contemporary writers may be much like myself, and then I'm not interested in them.
Are there any other questions?
If you would like to ask something, so.
I've asked permission.
Since I'm not allowed to ask anything, you might.
Well, you ask questions, perhaps.
No, I won't. I never ask questions, even in examinations.
You mentioned Plato as a philosopher. It seems to me that you admire. Are there other philosophers that you have been influential in your work?
Yes. I should say, besides Plato, I owe, well, an endless debt to Berkeley, to Hume, to Schopenhauer, I have named him, to Mautner, to Bradley, to Royce, well, to Bertrand Russell. I might go on. I think that those names are sufficient, especially the name of Berkeley and of Descartes also. Those names are names that mean much to me. I should have named them really. But I named Plato, and I have spoken also of the Kabbalah, of the Gnostics. I've gone in for some out-of-the-way reading. Really, I'm not a real student of philosophy.
You mentioned philosophers. I wonder if Unamuno has any bearing on your writings, like the other you wrote. Is it a counter?
Well, I think of Unamuno as being a fine writer, but as to his interest in personal immortality, I cannot share it. When I die, I want to die wholly. I want to die body and soul. And Unamuno seems strangely interested in having Miguel Unamuno going on and on. I don't know why.
I would like to ask you a question concerning time. This afternoon, when we were talking, you mentioned that it's the great enigma. I believe you said that.
Yes, the great
And if
red
you
of
read
it.
Vadim Khan, he calls it the Stero Satan,
Then,
advancing a kind of a Gnostic religion, I expect. Could you, this is a rather naive question in a sense, but could you perhaps boil down your attitude towards time before you spoke of eternity?
yes. Yes, I think
Is
that
time something negative to you or
No.
evil? Or?
No, I don't think of it as evil. I think that time is the one essential thing. Since we might think in terms of a spaceless universe. Space, after all, only belongs to sight, to what? To taste, to feeling. But what I think we might have, at least ideally, we might have a spaceless universe compounded of time. Let us say a universe compounded of mind, or of a single mind, of music and of words. And there were no need for space.
If, as in the circular ruin,
Yes.
you were suddenly to come up against, have the revelation that you were in fact dreamed by somebody else, what would that do to you after the initial surprise and after the wore off?
If I recall the circular ruins, when I wrote that story, the writing took me a week, 6 days perhaps. I was caught up by the story. I was leading my everyday life. I was going to a cinema. I was dining out with friends. I was going to my job, a small library in Buenos Aires. I was doing all those things. And yet I thought of those things as being unreal, as compared to a story of the dreamer who was being dreamt. So that story, I perhaps thought of as being my finest story, since it was the one story that caught me up and carried me away when I was writing it. I never had that sense of the story being more real than myself, the writer. But that was never allowed me afterwards. I've never written anything and been carried away by it.
Any other questions?
I don't know if you have said, how many languages have you written in, please? Have you written in Spanish?
Use the
Turkey, or
microphone,
in-
please.
Yes, I have written in Spanish, and I've attempted English, but I respected far too much to go on, no. And then, of course, I have done some writing in French, and some quite bad, justly forgotten Latin hexameters, and that's that. I can read Italian, I can read Portuguese, of course. I can even decipher Old English, but really, as to writing in those languages, quite beyond me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you write on a schedule or as the mood strikes you? Set time away per day?
No, I write of the Holy Ghost moves me, let us say, or the Spirit moves me. I have no schedule. Because I don't have a schedule, since I have to dictate what I write. So I have to fall back on friends and on chance visitors sometimes. But I seem to be writing things all the time. Because after all, since I am blind, I spend, well, some part of the day in loneliness. And then, of course, I try to be thinking things out, to be evolving poems, to be evolving short stories. And most of them will just fizzle out, but others remain with me, and then I try to lick them into form and to dictate them.
So your Borges, when you wrote Plum, Ukbar, and Orphan Stewardship, was that a spontaneous story, or were you attempting to create a parody of archaeological
No, I should say that many things went to the shaping of that story. I suppose it all came out of my love of encyclopedias. I think that I've done most of my reading in encyclopedias. Encyclopedia Britannica, Chambers Encyclopedias, Brockhaus Conversaciones Lexicon, Diccionario Enciclopédico Hispanoamericano, and so on. Those make for very good, very fine desultory reading. And then, since I seem to have run out of encyclopedias, I said how fine it would be were to find an encyclopedia not of this actual world, but of some other possible world. And then the whole idea of Tlön, Ukbar, Orbis Tertius came, and then I thought of how that encyclopedia of a finely ordered world might change the actual world. But of course I was aware that the world is being changed by books all the time. What we call reality has been changed, let us say, by the Bible, for example, by Plato, by the Latin poets. In fact, the world is being changed by books all the time. And then, of course, I wove many things into that story, and I wrote it down. I was amused when I wrote it. Then I also evolved that idea of a language based on idealism. But I wrote that also long ago. But I know that I felt quite happy when I was writing it. And many people seem to have taken to the story. In spite of the rather forbidding title, we have Tlön, that's a dark word that may be akin to a German Traum. Then Ukbar, that is an Oriental ring to it, an Arabic ring. And then after that, we get the brevity and the clarity of Latin, Orbis Tertius. I suppose the title is interesting. But that story took me quite some time in the writing, because I worked many things here. Many of my friends, for example, were also worked in.